So I have organized chronologically also, but I start with our own prehistory with Emmanuel. So, and then I'll go on the perks of sharing an office, on the perks of sharing the students, and then about the many happy returns we had in our collaborations. So I start with prehistory. So we were both young students in this lab, chained to our respective desks at two very remote places, so we didn't really meet. But we attended together this conference in Poiana Brașov, Romania in 1987. And so that's where we really met for the first time. And then we went on our separate ways, various postdocs and continuing our thesis and etc. And so now fast forward to 92, which is precisely where Bertrand stopped. So we are back from our respective postdocs, and we, by some random choice of the direction, we happen to share an office. Sharing an office is fantastic, especially with Emmanuel. So the first thing, of course, if you share an office here and you're a young student, you get more windows, right? You're no longer in the basement, you have windows, you can see the light. You have a larger blackboard, you get more visitors because, you know, twice as many. And then if you're really lucky, you have Emmanuel also. And so, well, together in a secluded place, we started talking. And so our first work was a mix of what we had learned during our respective theses. So membrane folding from Emmanuel and integrable lattice models from my part. Okay, so we wrote this paper, Entropy of Folding of a Triangular Lattice. So let me explain. So you have a sheet of paper, right, on which you have drawn a triangular lattice, okay, and you can fold it along the edges of a triangular lattice. So it's not very difficult to realize that this is an 11 vertex model. So for instance, if you look at this vertex here, you just, that's it. Okay. Yes, I got it back. So you fold it along the horizontal link here, and then on top of that, you fold it along this thing, which is reflected by the horizontal link, okay? So the strength of Emmanuel already in those days was about bijection and reformulation. And so he came up with this formulation, in which the flat sheet is just this triangular lattice, on which now you represent by a color the vector along the edge. Okay, so you have three vectors whose sum is 0 along the three edges of each triangle. Okay, and that's a flat sheet. And of course, when you fold things, you end up with a picture like this. Okay, and that was the key to understanding the foldings of a triangular lattice. Then this is really tricky. No? It comes back sometimes. So the idea is that now, if you concentrate on the, say, red and white links, they form loops, okay? But not just any loops, but what are called fully packed loops, right? So loops that are essentially everywhere, that occupy everything, okay? So this description of a folded sheet allowed, I think it's also Emmanuel, who figured out that actually Baxter had done the job of computing the entropy of this problem. And so it's a fully packed loop gas with n equals 2, so a weight 2 per loop. Why a weight 2? Because you see you can always interchange red and white along each loop, and this gives you a perfectly acceptable configuration. Okay, so two configurations per loop. Okay, and Baxter, in his science of integrable lattice model, managed to solve the Bethe-Ansatz equation, which are really nasty in that case, and provide us with an exact entropy, okay, entropy of folding. Okay, and then it went on from there. So with Mark, we went to higher dimensions, right? So actually, the folding itself takes place now on the FCC lattice. Okay, so you have all sorts of interesting creases, right? Different folds of various angles. And we were not capable of computing the exact entropy, 96 vertex model, it's a bit tricky, but we got some really interesting bounds. Okay, and then it went on from there. And so it went towards physics a little bit, so I'm sorry. Okay, so so we introduced this bending rigidity that Bertrand talked about. So far the membrane was called so-called phantom membrane, but it didn't see itself, right? But if you start including bending rigidity, of course it becomes a bit self-avoiding, right? And so there's a sequence of papers which I think culminated in this one, in which they have a very nice phase diagram of what's going on between the various states of folding of a membrane, from piled up, which is really crumpled, to totally flat, and with some intermediate states here. Okay, so that's for folding. Now you can say 2D, 3D. What about 1D? Okay, so with Emmanuel, we started. Okay, it's back. We started thinking about one-dimensional folding. So that is the folding of a polymer, basically. So in fact, it turns out that the problem of folding of polymer chain had been actually posed by pure mathematicians very, very long time ago. Actually, it's in a book by Édouard Lucas from 1891 called La théorie des nombres, okay, where he was quoting Émile Lemoine as asking this problem of des timbres postes. So the problem des timbres postes is essentially, in those days, at the post office, what you got is a strip of stamps, right? And so the idea is it's too long, a strip of stamps, so you want it to fit in your pocket. So you want to fold it as compactly as possible, right? So in modern terms, it's self-avoiding folding of a one-dimensional polymer. And so that's where we started working on meanders. So the problem had been revisited by Poincaré, in fact, in 1912, reactualized by Arnold in 1991 in some sort of mathematics recreation article in a Russian journal. And then the more serious work was done by Landon Zvonkin in those years, right? So we come next. Oops. So what are meanders? It's just a reformulation of the problem. So you see okay, so you have essentially a red road crossing a river through a fixed number of bridges, which has to be even. We know that since the Königsberg Bridge's problem. And, we have of such configurations what we call meanders and what we call a river has a source, and here you could as well close the river. Okay. Question is, count these for fixed n, find asymptotics, and if possible, universality classes for those problems. Okay. So first we started counting. So Golinelli came to the rescue and gave us this beautiful little program what actually counts the semi-meanders pretty much like they appear in this tree of semi-meanders. So you obtain the tree by applying these two moves. One of them is you really look only at the top of the picture, right? And so you cut an external arch and wrap it around. So that's one move. And the other move is just add up an extra arch, an extra circle around your picture. And so in this manner, of course, you get multi-component meanders, right? But it's enough to be able to count the one-component meanders, which the program does. Okay, so then we went to alternative descriptions by matrix integrals, by the Temperley-Lieb algebra. So a Temperley-Lieb algebra, that's kind of fun. Its representation theory involves half of a meander picture, like what you see on the top. And so putting them on top of each other amounts to doing a scalar product in a basis of a temporally Lie algebra. And therefore, the natural thing when you have a scalar product is to compute a Gram matrix. And the Gram matrix, it turns out, for the meanders, has some explicit form. So this explicit form we computed by doing a Gram-Schmidt orthogonalization of the matrix. But at the end of the process, you still have the norms to figure out. And that's where Emmanuel, with his magic for bijections, came up and found this nice formula for the exponents. So it's basically a product of Chebyshev polynomials to some integers. OK. And then something happened, right? We sort of started including the concept of quantum gravity. So it really gave us some sort of new direction to work on. And the first thing was how about the same problems that we've been looking before, but now on random triangulations, right? Instead of a fixed triangular lattice. So the first question that comes to mind is, first of all, is it foldable or not? Right? So it's not very difficult to convince yourself that a random triangulation is compactly foldable if and only if it's vertex tricolorable. Indeed, once you've folded it onto just one triangle, you can call blue, white, red the three colors of vertices. And when you unfold it, you have a tricoloring of the vertices. Okay. So the question was find the partition function of this model, sum over triangulations. Like in quantum gravity, you always have a term coupled to the genus of the surface, right, coming from the Einstein action. And then you want to keep track of a number of red, blue, and white vertices by these catalytic parameters, like the combinatorial lists say, and also a parameter to keep track of a number of edges. And so by solving the matrix model that corresponds to this expansion here, it's a tricky matrix model. You have to do a rectangular matrix model, and then the three parameters PQZ, it's perfectly symmetric in them, in this formulation, but it's highly non-symmetric. The last parameter is the ratio of the two sizes of the matrix, which is a rectangle. Okay, but the result is really remarkable. It's just a product of these three functions, the red, blue, and white function, which satisfy these relations. So the experts in trees will recognize generating functions of tricolored, vertex tricolored trees. And that's when we realized, or Emmanuel, in fact, realized that there were trees behind the triangulations, okay? And having realized that, he searched literature, and he stumbled onto the work of Gilles Schaeffer, which we had no knowledge whatsoever about. And that was really the beginning of a new era for us. But before I let Jeremy talk about this, let me just continue with Emmanuel's achievements here. So he continued working on this problem of folding triangulations. And another remark is that a triangulation is foldable if and only if it is face bicolorable. Again, you fold it, right? And so whenever you fold, one of the triangles, say, is pointing up, and the next is pointing down, right? So you can point up and down those triangles, right? And they alternate. So you need that the valency of each vertex in this triangulation be even, okay? So that's called an Eulerian triangulation, okay? So the dream would have been to solve my PHILIPPE loop n equals 2 model on Eulerian triangulations. That's the dream. The reality is a bit under the dream, but still it's very remarkable. Are predictions on the ON equals 0, so just one loop, and it's called a Hamiltonian cycle because it visits all the triangle exactly once on this random bicolor triangulation. So the first thing about this is to understand the physics of the PHILIPPE loop model on a flat lattice. Okay, first things first. So on a flat lattice, this is what it looks like. So remember, we have loops that go everywhere, right? What happens is that the gas of loops is described, at some critical point, is described by some conformal field theory, which has a certain central charge, which I call C dense, because it corresponds to a dense loop model, right? But on top of that, you can see here that the dual of the loops actually forms a lozenge tiling, right? So this is what I represent in red here, a rhombus tiling. And now we know that a rhombus tiling is also something like a piling up of cubes in a corner of a room, and so it has a degree of freedom, which is the height, right? So in fact, in addition, with the conformal field theory central charge for the loops, there's also another central charge coming from this height, which is just a Gaussian free field. And so the fully packed loop central charge is actually one more than the expected central charge for loops. So this analysis is due to Blöte noise, right? So there's this extra degree of freedom, which sort of pops up. So it's really bizarre because you constrain the thing more, right? It's fully packed. And yet out of this constraint, you get more freedom. Maybe it's food for thought. I don't know. OK, so next stage, now that we understand the flat space, we switch on quantum gravity. And so quantum gravity is well understood from the point of view of this KPZ formula, the other KPZ, right? Knizhnik, Polyakov, Zamolodchikov, which relates flat space scaling to random surface scaling, right? And it's really based, I mean, it's a field theory reasoning, which, for instance, François David in the lab participated in, which is understanding the coupling of metric field, which has Liouville action, to the conformal matter field. Okay, so these partition functions of random Eulerian triangulations with a single loop Hamiltonian cycle, and say with n triangles, behaves. We expect that it behaves at large n, like some exponential cosmological constant times n, because n is like the area of the surface, divided by n to some exponent, right, configuration exponent, and that exponent is given in terms of a central charge of a matter theory in this form, right? That's the KPZ formula for you. So now for n equals 0, you compute C dense, you find -2, so C fully packed is one more, it's -1, you stick it in there, and you find this beautiful new exponent, -1 minus square root 13 over 6, which appeared in this paper. So there's some fun combinatorics associated to that, because, so this is also what my Eulerian triangulation looks like, right? So black and white coloring of a triangle, so this is the dual, right? So phi cube graph, bicolored vertices, and the Hamiltonian cycle is this blue line, right? Okay. Now, question is, if we relax vertex bicoloration here, what happens? Well, the degree of freedom, the extra degree of freedom that we had, this +1 in the central charge, actually disappears if you remove this, just because it doesn't allow for defining the same degrees of freedom, right? And so what you expect at least is, instead of C equals -1, have C equals -2, and therefore the gamma is much simpler in that case, it's -1. And indeed, you can compute exactly what happens. So this summation now, without the bicoloring, is just a very simple calculation with Catalan numbers. And you find this behavior with n cubed, which indeed is 2 to the minus gamma, with gamma equals to -1. In combinatorics, this identity is known as the counting of alternating Baxter permutations, another Baxter unrelated to the other one. Okay, so then we continued working on this. We managed to do the n equals 1 case, so still not n equals 2, with Charlotte, who is here. And this was actually very simple, but it took some doing. It turns out that the matrix model was solvable for this problem. Okay. So why am I calling this many happier returns? Because 24 years later, we restarted working on the same problem, this time with Bertrand, Olivier Golinelli, right? And we found new things, right? So a new subtlety. For instance, KPZ breaks down, in fact. It has to be tweaked. And what we found out is that this extra degree of freedom had to receive a different stiffness than the actual other degrees of freedom. And we did that by looking at operators and doing some numerics, and it's going on with this new paper here. Okay, so that's what happened. Meanders the end. So in view of all this, with all that stuff that happened, it gave Emmanuel this new idea of looking at meanders with a new perspective, right? That of a two-loop model on a random quadrangulation. So it's really a model coupled to gravity, right? And here you have two types of loops, right? The red, the roads and the rivers, right? The blue and the red. Problem is that when you look at this fully packed loop model already on the square lattice, you have two types of contact between the two. One is intersection and the other is tangency. Okay? So the question is, if we want to identify the universality class of meanders, we have a choice. Is it Eulerian, in which case we expect this extra degree of freedom, and then the calculation would give us a central charge -3. But there's this tangent vertex, which is a problem, right? And it looks very relevant, okay? And if it's relevant, then it means it's another problem. It's not the problem we want to solve. So the other solution, which turns out to be the right one, is to say, actually, we're not looking at Eulerian quadrangulations. In this case, the dual of a meander is just a quadrangulation, not a triangulation. And then we don't have this extra degree of freedom, and the identified central charge is -2, right? But we still have this annoying problem that we have two types of vertices. And that's where also Emmanuel, with his command of field theory, came to the rescue and realized that in the field description, so basically you're going to have heights living on the faces of a meander, right? With certain Ampere rule as to how the heights change when you cross a river or a road. And he realized that the tangent vertex actually was irrelevant, really in the sense of the definition of his height, that the height on the bottom here and the height on the top have to be the same. So it's as if these two lines were not touching, okay? So, and that solved the problem. And here is the solution now. The central charge is indeed 4. Gamma has this weird form. And the meander configuration exponent is 29 plus square root 145 over 12. So I think this is one nail in the coffin of this self-avoiding polymer question. But there's also a lot of remaining questions. Well, first of all, it's not completely rigorous, right? And some people now are really working hard, especially from the probability theory point of view, to try to make this more serious. There was extremely good numerical evidence. We participated in that, but also from other people. And there's also a bunch of more exponents, which I don't have time to talk here. Okay, having set a foot in gravity, we also looked at Lorentzian gravity. So again, with Charlotte, we worked out some interesting relation between random surfaces, which are not as random, right? They're time-ordered 1 + 1 dimensional surfaces. And it turns out that there's an interesting bijection with trees. And guess who found that? And then some higher dimensional generalizations, okay, which involved. So as you can see, as I go, we are getting into more and more combinatorial stuff, right? And I think that's also a good description of some phase transition that happened to Emmanuel, right? And in this case, we rediscovered the Vienno's heaps of pieces, and we had some very interesting interactions with Vienno. Okay, to summarize, we wrote this physics report. And that was the point at which we started sharing a student, right? Now, on the perks of sharing a student, especially if it's Jeremy, you will have to see his talk to see more about this. But here, I could say that it allowed us to go into a new subject, write 11 papers. And as of last week, we also have among our former students, a brand new director of Institut Henri Poincaré. Okay, so the last work that we've done together with Emmanuel, so it's also part of a happy returns because now we are in 2018, is about gases, now not loops, but of paths simply, and how they collectively behave in the thermodynamic limit. And to study that, there's a very interesting method introduced by Colombo and Sportiello, like 2 years before we started working on this, which consists in looking at this gas of paths, or spaghetti if you want, and try to understand what happens to the outermost path as a result of a non-intersection of all these paths, right? So it induces some correlation, right, between the paths, and as a result there's a limit shape which takes place. And to understand the limit shape, what you have to do is to take the last path, move its end somewhere, and look at what happens to it. So there's two things, right? There's when the path is outside of a domain, it just follows a geodesic, in this case a straight line. And when it's inside the domain, it starts going towards the other set of paths and ends up being tangent to them, hence the name tangent method. So if you're able to calculate this partition function and that partition function and optimize it with respect to the position of this intersection point W, then you can predict the shape of this curve. So which is what we did in various problems. At some point we also introduced some extra interaction, which was an area weight for the paths, and then it follows that the tangent method has to be adapted a little bit because the geodesics now are in a curved background, but everything works fine. So the last work is about a different type of model, so still a model of non-intersecting paths, but a little less non-intersecting, which are called osculating paths, which occur in models like the 6-vertex model, which are known to be non-free fermion this time. Free fermions was for non-intersection. Non-free fermion now is for these osculating paths. So we looked at the 20-vertex model, which is just the ice model on the triangular lattice. Okay, so you have 20 vertex configurations. Ice model means that I orient the edges in such a way that at each vertex there's free entering and free outgoing edges. This is the path formulation, so to these there's a bijection here with paths, and as you can see there's even triple kissings of paths, double kissings, or just single paths. Okay, so we looked at specific boundary conditions and we found some nice sequence of integers. And Emmanuel, again, he knew very little, I think, about integrable system, Young-Baxter equation, etc. But he immediately found a way of solving these problems once we had come up with the right Boltzmann weights, which is basically moving lines around using the Young-Baxter equation, and ending up finding that the uniform 20 vertex has to do with a 6-vertex model, but with very specific weights. Okay, so I gave a talk in Japan at that point, and I think I sent my slides to Emmanuel to check that everything was all right. And Emmanuel, and this is really one of his amazing strengths, looked at this picture and immediately found a way to make a nice joke. And here is the joke. He realized that on the label of his lattice of Kagome delicious beverages from Japan, there was this 20 and this 6 hiding, right? And he sent me back immediately his picture. So that's Emmanuel. And the meaning is that there's 20 vegetables and 6 fruits in each of those things, which makes it even more delicious. Then, on the same problem, we found what we call non-bijections. Non-bijections because these are sets of objects that are enumerated by the same numbers, and we have no idea why. Okay? We can compute those numbers, but we have no idea why they are connected. So we have these two interesting conjectures, which are still holding. And then we did the problem of finding Arctic curves. And as you can see, this starts looking like a coffee kernel, right? With uniform weights, 20 vertex. This is the more general phase diagram that we came up with. And we also had a stolen Belgian student to do the numerics here. And we figured out the best thing after a bijection. So we had a non-bijection between these guys and those guys. And what we found is that there's a sort of asymptotic bijection, that the limit shapes are actually the same, right? If you only consider a portion of this limit shape, it's this degree 10 algebraic equation. So same portion of Arctic curve for the two problems. Okay, the many talents of Emmanuel, master of bijection. Now you're convinced, I hope. He has a fantastic intuition for field theory description. I think you should also be convinced. He's a true physicist, as opposed maybe to me. He always asks the right questions, and that's extremely precious. He's meticulous and unstoppable when it comes to calculations. And finally, last but not least, he's an artist. So he came up with his, I mean, you open any of his papers and you will find these amazing pictures. You can immediately recognize that Emmanuel did them, right? And I like this one particularly. Okay, so 32 years ago, that's what we looked like. This is with Golinelli on the bottom. And that's at the 30 years celebration of Service de Physique Théorique. And bon anniversaire, Emmanuel.